Well, thank you again to all of you for coming to this second lecture. As I was saying, we are going to see today the Begriffsgeschichte, the history of the School of Conceptual History in German, whose best representative is Reinhard Koselleck. But first, I want to address the point that was pending from the previous lecture. What was the foundations, the philosophical foundations of this school? Go to the next slide. I know you like it. So. Well, the fundamental point is that we must place the development of these theories, both the Skinner's theory and Koselleck's theory, in the context of the break of the evolutionary conceptions of history that was produced at the end of the 19th century. The result of it was a bifurcation of the level at the level of the underlying system of knowledge. And I want you to keep it in mind because I'll go back on it. Well, the new epistemic ground which could traverse Western thinking as a whole, including both natural sciences and the humanities, will be articulated around the opposition between self-regulated systems and transcendental subjectivity. Well, a good example of it is the emergence of electrodynamics elaborated by Maxwell and Faraday. It marked the transition from a physics of elements to a physics of fields, like language for the socio. An electrodynamic field is not a set of elements, but a system of relationships among elements. Now, fields lack a principle of self-transformation. They only tend to reproduce their internal balance of homeostasis. Hence, change may come to them only from outside, from an external instance that produces a perturbance in the system, forcing their reconfiguration. This is the basis of the series of oppositions like that between synchrony and diachrony, rationality and change, systems and transcendental subjectivity, which articulated the entire regime of knowledge of the 20th century. And it was also expressed in the field of historical thinking. The neo-Kantian philosophies of history that Sebastian knows about it, that emerged at that time were erected on the basis of the opposition between sciences of spirit and natural sciences, nomotetical and ideographical sciences, explanation and comprehension, what was called at that moment the first term operation. When they were founded on the idea, which is also a fundamental assumption behind Skinner's theory, that the distinguishing feature of social actions is their intentional nature. Thus, unlike natural events, they cannot be explained by causes, but they demand teleological explanation. That is, they must be explained according to the ends to which they were addressed, the intention of the agents. Well, the key figure here is Wilhelm Dilthey. He proposed to complete the Kantian system with a critique of historical reason. According to him, the fundamental difference between the science of spirit and natural sciences is that in the former, the unity of the subject and the object is ontological and not only epistemological, as Kant thought. Knowledge in natural sciences demands categories which are projected by the subject upon the thing, but are alien to the latter. Instead, in the science of spirit, the object is not external to the subject, but immanent in it. Tiltai follows here Vico's principle that one knows what one made. God created the world, and only him can know it. Man creates history so that he can know it. In this case, the alterity between the subject and the thing in itself is overcome. The latter bears the seal of the symbolic. It already belongs to the sphere of culture. Well, the key concept here is that of living experience, or Erlebnis in German. It is the true object of historical knowledge. What matter are not the events, but the way in which events are experienced. In this case, the coincidence is always perfect. Experiences are exactly the way they are experienced. That's in the knowledge in historical sciences is in German innewerden. There's a self-realization of what is already inside us. To put an example, to understand how the world changed after the Twin Towers, it is not important to know how exactly the planes crashed the towers, but how people experienced that event. For Tiltai and the Neo-Kantians, it is the meaningful character of social actions that allow subjects to break their individual isolation and communicate with each other, thereby constituting themselves as social beings. And it is also what makes it possible for the various historical experiences to be mutually interconnected, constituting this historical life. Well, this is the premise for historical time. Experiences intertwine, forming diachronic, meaningful networks. Intentional actions are imbricated, articulating past, present, and future in a unity of sense. As Tiltai says, one cannot propose as an end something that didn't previously experience as a value. However, this unity of orientation is existential and not logical. The web of experiences does not form a rationally integrated course, but only one existentially constituted. It excludes the presence of a single final end towards which the whole historical course is oriented. Well, it marks the end of the teleological evolutionary concept of history and the emergence of a new concept of historical time founded on the idea of historical ruptures. As Bergson said at that same time is invention or is nothing. And Tiltai insisted, and I quote, "In all understanding, there is an irrational, since life is also irrational. It is not possible to represent it by means of any formula or our logical activity," unquote, a role in which Hegel would have doubled. And I quote, Hegel says, Tiltai builds metaphysically, we analyze what is given. But however, it will raise the problem of the re-experience. Given the presence of breaks in historical evolution, the question that emerges is, how can we understand the cultures and times with which we don't no longer keep an existential link, in which those links have become broken? And there re-emerges then the specter of transcendence. The object of historical knowledge is no longer immanent in us, so that we must recreate it through categories that we project upon it, but are alien to it. Well, at this point, Dilthey takes resort to the idea of nature, that is, the presence of a uniform substrate of human nature that communicates men from different times and cultures, allowing historical intelligibility. However, Dilthey faced another and even more serious problem in his philosophical system, actually the opposite to the former: how to explain historical ruptures, how the break of the structural connections of living experiences is produced. To put it in his own words, how can we project upon the future ends that are not already part of our ground of experience, or eventually meanings that are alien to our horizon of intelligibility? Well, it is here that he appeals again to the idea of nature, although in an opposite sense. It is the fact for him of having to deal with the nature that escapes our control what prevents the articulation of historical development as a close, rationally integrated course, opening it to historicity, to temporality. Lastly, it confronts us with the evidence of the finitude, the contingency of our existence. When in this fashion, the idea of nature enters in Dilthey's system in two opposite senses, as that which provides unity to the historical course and that which prevents it, which breaks the unity, the linearity of evolutionary processes. In any case, this means that his whole historical concept is founded on a premise that demolishes it. The introduction of a factor like nature, which is transcendent to the subject, breaks the premise of his whole project of a critique of historical reason, as well as the opposition between natural and historical sciences, that is, the idea of the ontological unity of the subject and the object, the condition of possibility of historicity thus escapes the historical social realm, sending back again to a thing in itself ungraspable, transcendent to the subject, and as a consequence, as Vico stated, which only God could know. We thus get Koselleck's conceptual history. It must also be inscribed within the framework of the Neo-Kantian philosophies of history. As a matter of fact, it was Dilthey the first who originally proposed the elaboration of a Begriffsgeschichte. Yet, at the same time, Koselleck deviated from the Neo-Kantian tradition of Ideengeschichte, introducing a more radical sense of the historicity of conceptual formations. Actually, the Ideengeschichte didn't ignore the fact that ideas shift their meanings over time. Yet, it is true that to define its object, it had to assume the presence of a conceptual core that remains unchanged behind the meaningful transformation that the given idea undergoes. This unchanging conceptual core is what identifies the idea as a single entity throughout the various semantic contexts in which it appears. It is here that the difference established by Koselleck between ideas and concepts becomes relevant. The semantic changes that the concepts undergo historically are radical. Concepts incorporate very different and indeed mutually contradictory definitions, what makes them inevitably plurivocal, as Nietzsche said, which is also the motto, Koselleck's motto, only that which has no history can be defined. For Koselleck, Ideengeschichte failure to come to terms with the radical historicity of discursive formations ultimately had conceptual foundations. While that tradition did not ignore that ideas change with the context of their utterance, these two levels were seen as keeping a merely external link. The eventuality of the appearance of an idea in a given context seems to be an external circumstance, a vicissitude that doesn't alter its definition, which could be perfectly established with independence of that circumstance. For Koselleck, instead, only when a term incorporates different particular connotation does it become a concept. And it is due to this capacity of concept of transcending the immediate realms of living experience and projecting over time that Begriffsgeschichte sheds its subordinate relation to social history. As he states, conceptual history overcomes social history because only it can provide clues to recreate the long-term historical processes. Ultimately, to the extent that concepts serve to meaningfully articulate the different historical experiences, they also work as indexes of historical variations. That is, its concepts act retrospectively as indexes of historical experience, it is because they are at the same time factor for its constitution. Concepts provide social agents with the tools to understand the meaning of their actions, thus raising raw experience, the pure perception of facts and events, into living experience, Erlebnis. In this way, concepts also intertwine the various experiences, becoming the pillars for structural connections in history. We find here Begriffsgeschichte's main contribution. Unlike frequent thought, the German conceptual history does not intend merely to trace the history of individual concepts, as the idea of a dictionary suggests. Koselleck considers the history of individual concepts as sorts of windows to observe the broader transformations on the level of the horizons of meaning within which concepts can display, as it happened at the period he calls Sattelzeit. He thus reoriented the focus of research from concepts to their semantic conditions of possibility. It is related again with the aim of preventing conceptual anachronisms. Yet the point that it raises is how these long-term conceptual formations, the horizons of meaning, break, giving rise to the emergence of new ones. To put it in another way, how can a concept subvert its own discursive premises? Actually, it is unthinkable in Koselleck's theory. No concept, he says, and I quote, may be so new that it is not virtually constituted in the given language and do not take its meaning of the linguistic context inherited from the past. It is here that Koselleck appeals to the idea of social history. While conceptual history for Koselleck transcends social history in as much as it articulates long-term meaningful networks of lived experience, conceptual history is at the same time deficient with respect to social history, insofar as only the latter, social history, can explain the dislocation of the structures. It is because, as he states, the realization of an action always exceeds its mere utterance or symbolic representation. And this could explain why the living expectation sedimented in a concept may be frustrated, paving the way for the generation of new meanings for it. We must therefore speak of the double excess in the relationship between conceptual and social history, between the linguistic and the extra-linguistic levels. In short, between structures and events. When here we meet the fundamental inconsistency in Koselleck theory. As we have seen, the attempt to think the historicity of discursive formations led Koselleck to undermine the opposition between text and context, between language and the extra-linguistic reality. For him, historical experience is not a crudely empirical reality, one independent of the way in which it has been invested with meanings. That is why concepts are always constitutive of it. They are historical factors, since according to his own theory, there is no meaningless history. A mere happening is not yet a historical event. What makes it so, it is its meaningful nature. And I quote, history would simply be that which had already been conceptualized, unquote. At that point, however, at the moment of explaining conceptual change, concepts become indexes of realities for which they have not been factors in their constitution. But this is inconceivable according to his own theory, something that contradicts its premises, since for it, as I have said, only the meaningful nature of event turns them into historical events. In short, within the concept of Koselleck theory, the idea of a social history that is of a realm of historical reality that is not traversed by conceptual webs represents a terminological contradiction, an oxymoron, like saying a non-historical history. Now, although the idea of an opposition between conceptual history and social history is theoretically untenable, since it contradicts the premises of his theory, Koselleck could never abandon it, since in his view, only it can explain conceptual change. He thus will insist on that no deed is reducible to its linguistic expression, and he says in his contention with Gadamer, and then repeated countless times, it is not the same to say, I am gonna kill you as killing someone. And it is evident, no action can be reduced to its modes of enunciation. However, this is not the point here. It refers to the nature of the very object and not of its linguistic representation. It refers to that symbolic dimension that participates in the ontological reality itself, that is constitutive of historical reality, a factor of it in Koselleck's words. To continue with his own example, I know that this is not a good example here, but it is just a metaphor. Please take as a metaphor. That's it. When if someone assassinates a king, he or she is not simply destroying a bunch of meat, bones, and guts. It is not merely a material fact. What he or she is destroying is a symbolic place, what the king represents. And the same goes for any other acts of violence. If I hit someone, I am not only physically doing something to him or her, but I am also saying something with that action. We could here invert Austin's formula. The question now is not how to do things, excuse me. Yeah, The question is not how to do things with actions. What matters is not the fact itself, the material action, but its meaning, what is said by doing what is done. So the point is how to say things with actions. The category of social history, like that of the author in Skinner and nature in Dilthey, actually works here as the name for that transcendent instant that produces the reconfiguration of conceptual systems, which, as we have seen, now lack an inner principle of self-transformation and only tend to reproduce their inner logic. That category is therefore necessary for the articulation of his theories, since only it explains conceptual change, which is the main assumption in his theory, but it has no possible room within it, since it is destructive of its premises, the postulate that there is no meaningless history, that only concepts turn a mere fact into a historical event. If there were something like it that is a crudely empirical realm of historical reality, that like social history, that is not always traversed by conceptual wells, all that which Koselleck had previously said could be senseless. In sum, the category of social history is what Hans Blumenberg calls an absolute metaphor, something at once necessary yet impossible to conceptualize, something that his theory demands for its constitution, but is destructive of its premises. It is actually only the name for a problem that still demands to be unpacked. Lastly, what we have seen reveals a deeper epistemological problem. This tension results from the fact that although he introduced, again, the Ideengeschichte, a more radical sense of the historicity of conceptual formations, in his view, they still lack an immanent principle of historicity. Contingency is, again, something that comes to intellectual history, to conceptual history from outside. So the challenge it poses is how to think of contingency as a dimension inherent to conceptual formation. This new idea of the temporality of conceptual formation would emerge as a result of a new epistemic break produced at the end of the 20th century. And this leads us to France. But before moving there, we need to observe a further characteristic that separates history of languages of the history of ideas, which only later Koselleck makes explicit and is closely connected with the former point. That political languages, unlike ideas, are not merely subjective attributes, but objective entities as well. Well, that's something that Niklas has quoted in his book too. In the last volume of the Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, Koselleck, that was 25 years after its original publication, Koselleck discovered that while he has intended to deal with what he called fundamental political and social concepts, he has never defined what should be understood by it. Then he proposed to fill this gap and added a prologue in which he introduced a definition of what for him a fundamental concept is. And this definition is extremely interesting since it aims precisely at distinguishing a history of ideas from a history of political languages. And as he remarks, I'll read it. In a historical context, one can speak of a basic concept when all conflicting social layers and political parties are using it to communicate the different experiences, interests, and party politics programs. Basic concepts demand their use because they comprise those minimal similarities that are necessary for making experiences, and without which there can be neither conflict nor consensus. A basic concept is thus found when it can be interpreted and used according to different perspectives in order to gain insight or facilitate capacity to act. That is why the semantic of our conceptuality is neither subjective nor objective, neither idealistic nor materialistic, but both things at the same time in the linguistic milieu. Accordingly, it would make no sense to speak, for example, of a liberal language or a Republican language if we understand them as referring to particular ideologies or current of thought. A political language refers to that common ground for different ideologies. As Koselleck says, what makes a political or social concept a fundamental concept is that all the different authors in a given context use it. They thus transcend the ideas or ideologies of the agents that participate in it, encompassing all of them. The concept of temporality that Koselleck analyzes refers to it. There is not a given temporality for those who think in one way and a different one for those who think in another way. The changes that he analyzes, those produced during the subtle side, are not ideological changes. They are epochal changes. They traverse the different ideologies. As he says, and I quote, this, at the end of this quotation too, the semantics of our conceptuality is neither subjective nor objective, neither idealistic nor materialistic, but rather both things at the same time in the linguistic milieu. The presence of a symbolic dimension that participates of the ontological realm is in fact one of the premises of the French tradition of intellectual history. In the next lecture, we are going to see the French political conceptual history, but let me anticipate now the fundamental aspect that separates it from the preceding two schools, the Anglo-Saxon and the German school. Actually, it is a Descartes, and we cannot speak here of a school. That label indicates a series of very different approaches, but that nevertheless converge towards the general trend to transcend the level of the referential contents of the text and to analyze their discursive conditions of possibility. Not what authors said, but how was it possible for these authors to say what they said? But this undertaking would deploy in France in the different direction from the other school discussed above. In their attempt to do so, authors in France could address their attention to a third dimension of language, the syntactic or formal structure of discourses. Following the Saussure definition that language is not a substance but a form, the French political conceptual history will understand languages not as sets of statements concerning the state of the world, but as devices to produce statements. They thus refers us back to a second-order dimension of symbolic reality, to the means of productions of concepts. This definition it doesn't move. This redefinition allows us to better explain the difficulties that historians of ideas find when defining political languages. It is not because they change their meanings historically, as Koselleck stated, but rather for the reason that, excuse me, okay, but rather for the reason that, unlike the model of thinking, languages don't consist of sets of principles or maxims, just as one cannot define the English language, listing all that can be said in it, since it is infinite. Political languages cannot be defined in that way either. Lastly, languages are semantically indeterminate. That is, they accept very different and indeed contradictory forms of articulation on the level of the ideological contents. One can perfectly say one thing as well as the opposite thing in perfect English. It is thus necessary to distinguish between languages and ideas. Very different and indeed contradictory ideas may nevertheless derive from the same conceptual matrix of language. And conversely, the same ideas could be found articulated within different languages, in which case the same idea, however, obtain different meanings. As Foucault remarks, the statement, dreams are the expressions of desires, has a very different meaning if spoken by Plato or by Freud. Thus, the finding of semantic changes may well lead us to lose sight of the persistence of the former conceptual matrices within which they were produced, and vice versa. The continuities observable on the level of the surface of ideas may eventually hide fundamental rearrangement on the level of the underlying political languages from which those ideas take their concrete meanings. Well, this sends us back to the question that has been pending since the beginning of the formal lecture, with reference to the problem of presentism. That is, given that our ways of knowing are conditioned by our present conceptual frameworks, how can we nevertheless prevent historical research becoming tautological, merely a confirmation or an illustration of what we already knew beforehand, except for purely factual empirical issues, such as when this or that idea appeared? From this perspective, even though the intellectual historian always has to start from a theory, unlike the schemes based on models of thinking or ideal types, which prescribe in advance what we will find, it is not the case with languages. To the extent that the language is semantically indeterminate, it is no longer possible to pre-establish what an author may have produced with it, since what can be said within a given language is unpredictable. The range of options is always infinite. Hence, only as the result of historical research itself can we discover what a certain author or group of authors did with it. The reorientation of the focus of historical intellectual research from ideas to languages is in some the only way to open up room for historical analysis, one whose path and point of arrival is undeterminable a priori. Here we can see the root of the problem found by the two preceding schools when trying to explain conceptual change. As we have seen in reference to Skinner, this problem results from this taking semantic changes of ideas and the accumulation of them for shifts in political languages. The focus on the forms of discourse has implicit a much more sophisticated way of positing the issue of conceptual change, as well as the relationship between language and speech. It raises the paradox, not at all easy to explain, of how an utterance produced within a given language, the validity of whose logic therefore presupposes, may eventually twist that logic, paving the way to the emergence of discursive universes that are strange to it. To put it in Skinner's terms, how a move by an agent can alter not only the position of the pieces, but also the board itself. To put it still in another way, how can one say something in correct English according to the rules of formation of statements of the language, and yet dislocate those rules on whose basis it has been constructed and transformed them? Ultimately, the notion of form brings to the forefront the fact that the phenomena of conceptual rupture in history are extremely intricate and hard to explain. It reveals why the view that they occur because at some point an author comes to introduce new meanings in the speech of an epoch is simplistic. In sum, addressing the phenomena of conceptual ruptures demand a stronger view regarding the temporality of discursive formations, the conception of a kind of historicity inherent to intellectual history, which is not only derivative of social history or the result of the action of presumably superior individuals. This is precisely what marked the transition from structuralism to post-structuralism. What we will see in the next lecture is how it reformulated the studies in the field of political conceptual history in France.